The Edmonton Oilers have several different players who are candidates to play in the top six on the wing. Who breaks out and who doesn't on today's edition of Locked On Oilers.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I just wrapped up my third NHL season as a host on the Locked On Podcast Network, and I want to thank you to anyone who is making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we've got your team covered every day. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. So, on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, we're going to bounce through several of the Oilers wingers in a descending order of how likely I think they are to be successful this upcoming season and sticking, and I wouldn't say breaking out because some of these guys have pretty extensive NHL track records, but I think this is how I would rank them in terms of how likely they are to make a really positive impact, to stick in the top six, or in the case of one of these guys, maybe solidify himself in a bigger role than we had expected. So, to start things out, the player I think of this cohort that is most likely to break out is Andrew Mangiapane. Now, some of that might be my preconceived biases. I love Andrew Mangiapane. He's one of my favorite players in the NHL. His motor, his tenacity, his forechecking ability. He is a very versatile player. And what do we always talk about here on Locked On Oilers? My everydayers know we talk about making yourself available and the idea that the more ice you can earn, the better the chance you have of producing counting stats. And we know statistically that the more ice time you play, the more likely you are to produce numbers. And it's not a coincidence that Mangiapane put up lower numbers the fewer minutes he plays. And look, for a guy like Mangiapane, who's not a true top six forward in terms of raw ability, he's not an elite skater, he's not an elite finisher, he's pretty good at most areas of the game. He's a very well-rounded player. He can play on the left or on the right, which is something that I think does help. I think he should sneak onto the Oilers penalty kill, whether it be the first or the second unit. That's a matter up for conversation, but there's a path here for Mangiapane to carve himself out a role and to earn Chris Knoblauch's trust. And I think by definition, when we're talking about somebody who has a pretty significant track record of NHL success, somebody who has a lot of ice time killing penalties, and somebody who is generally considered pretty defensively responsible and a pretty strong forechecker, I think you saw it last year. I think there's a world where Mangiapane can be the better version of what Vasily Podkolzin is. And look, that's not a knock on Podkolzin, who had a really good first season as an Oiler, and he's somebody I didn't even categorize on this episode because I think he's pretty established that he can play anywhere up and down the lineup, and Chris Knoblauch's going to feel reasonably good about that. When it comes to Mangiapane, the goal scoring, look, the 130-goal season in Calgary very much seems to be an outlier. And real quick, on the subject of outliers, an outlier season is not fraudulent. It is not deceitful. Yes. Is it lucky? Of course. That's what it takes sometimes to get those positive outlier seasons. You get slightly better shooting percentage. Your line mates all have slightly better shooting percentage. The overall quality of your team. You go back and look at that Flames team from 2021, 2022, especially their back end, one of the better defensive units in the league that season. It's not a huge surprise that Mangiapane, among several players on that team, had career years. I mean, all three players on that team's first line, Elias Lindholm, Johnny Gaudreau, and Matthew Tkachuk, had north of 100 points. So it's not necessarily a surprise that Mangiapane exploded in the way he did down that lineup, even though he was mostly playing with Blake Coleman and Michael Backlund. Now, why he might not? That was an outlier season. That, by definition, is not something within his normal range of outcomes. That's not to say it's impossible, but it is unlikely. Number two, we have seen Mangiapane for a few years now removed from a shoulder injury that has really, I don't want to say nerfed, but diminished his shooting ability to some degree. And some people would say, well, the further removed from that injury he is, the more likely he is to be closer to full health. And while that might be the case, it's also been a couple years now, and that shooting touch has yet to really return in the way that most people had expected it. Number two, I think the simple matter of the fact is we know the Oilers are kind of picky as to who gets to play with Connor and who gets to play with Leon. Yes, we talked about it a minute ago. Mangiapane being able to play on the left and the right does help as far as his case to play in that top six. But we can assume Zach Hyman's going to be on McDavid's right. And we can assume that I'm going to assume at least Ryan Nugent-Hopkins is going to start the year on McDavid's left, which means the opportunities to get into the top six are playing with Leon Draisaitl. And look, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Nuge is going to be the third line center and Ike Howard is going to be that first line left wing. And we'll get to Howard in a minute. But I do think there's a stronger case for Mangiapane to stick in the top six than pretty much everybody else on this list because of the perception of him as a player and his toolbox. I think his forechecking ability will make him very useful and functional no matter where he plays in the lineup. And speaking of Ike Howard, who is next up on our list here, the last person we'll do in our first segment, the strongest reason I think Ike Howard is going to have a good first season and stick in the top six, the Oilers have skin in the game now. It's not like this was a free agent signing. It's not like this was a player who was low cost. They traded a player who they took in the first round last year. And look, Stan Bowman didn't make that draft pick. He didn't trade up to go get O'Reilly. He didn't make those decisions. But he traded a developing player for somebody who was a year older for help right away. Number two, Howard effectively bet on himself. This is somebody who wanted to start his entry-level contract clock so that he could get to restricted free agency sooner rather than later. This was the sticking point for him in Tampa Bay. The Lightning weren't sure if they were going to have an NHL spot for him. He didn't want to go to the AHL. He wanted to play, and he wanted to play right now. And the Oilers, I won't say parted the Red Sea, but they traded for him full well knowing they needed a top six forward. So their material investment in his success, that goes a long way. You know, when a team invests in you, whether it's money, whether it's draft picks, whether it's trade compensation, that is an implicit understanding that, hey, you need to deliver for us. And I think the Oilers are going to have skin in the game to the degree that they feel they need to give Howard a little bit more of a benefit of the doubt than maybe some of the other younger guys in the organization because of the combination of him both wanting to get his entry-level contract ticking and the fact that they traded to acquire him based on the idea he was more or less ready to go. I mean, at 21 years old, after several years in college, some time at Minnesota Duluth and at Michigan State, there's enough of a track record there that there probably isn't a whole lot for him left to do at a developmental level. Sure. Could he get his body in better shape for an 82-game season? I'm sure. That is my single biggest reason I think that Ike Howard probably doesn't break out in year one. It's just the physical demands of going from a college season that's about 40 games to an NHL season that's 82. Even if you're in a limited role where you're only playing 13, 14 minutes per night, it's really hard on your body. And look, he's not a goalie making the jump from 20 starts to 50. It's not quite that dire. It's not like Jack Campbell with Toronto a couple years ago. It's not like Stolarz this past year in Toronto. I think it's a little bit easier if you're a winger going from 40 games to 80 games, but it's still going to be physically demanding. And then the other part of this, can he earn Chris Knoblauch's trust? We saw it happen in real time. It took Dylan Holloway a little while for Knoblauch to really give him a promotion, let him play with Draisaitl a little bit more. I think there is definitely a path to Ike Howard performing well and earning Chris Knoblauch's trust, but we saw it with Jeff Skinner last year. Jeff Skinner, hell of a lot more of a proven player than Ike Howard. You know, Jeff Skinner has 10 plus years in the NHL, more than one 30-goal season, and Chris Knoblauch didn't like his forechecking, didn't like his defense, and that was enough to sink his chances of sticking in the lineup for an extended period of time. So if Howard doesn't have those elements to his game, I would not be surprised if we see him miss games here and there by coach's decision to give him a bit more refinement to his game. We are going to take our first break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we're going to talk about two forwards who are probably going to end up being middle sixers, but don't count them out as far as being in the top six and a whole lot more on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. We've all been there, logging on early while we're at work and begging and pleading with the ticket gods to get concert tickets. Only then do you get the unfortunate reality you didn't get them. Live music should be about making memories, not dealing with the stress of ticket shopping, and that's where Game Time comes in. Game Time makes getting concert tickets faster and easier than ever. Did you know prices actually drop the closer it gets to showtime? And you can save as much as 60% off with their killer last-minute deals. If you're tired of endless scrolling trying to find the best bang for your buck, Game Time Zone Deals pick the best seats in your section for you. My personal favorite part of the Game Time ticket experience is the panoramic seat view, so you know what the view from your seat looks like before you get to the show. And with Game Time, the price you see is the price you pay. There are no hidden fees. And if you're worried about what happens when plans change, the Game Time guarantee has your back with cancellation protection and more. If you're ready to take the guesswork out of buying concert and show tickets with Game Time, download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers as we continue our march through July towards the Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers as we continue our march towards the dog days of summer in August, where NHL news is like tumbleweeds in the Old West. And for now, at least, we have to find things to think about. And the offseason is really, like a lot of life, what you make of it. And I am trying to approach this offseason from a forward-thinking and a bit more of an abstract position, because most logic and most reason would dictate the Oilers are probably going to have some regression here somewhere. Now, whether that's just because of the goal scoring they've lost, you lose a Corey Perry, an Evander Kane, a Victor Arvidsson, a Jeff Skinner, and you didn't really replace that with a whole lot in terms of proven offense. The recipe here has changed ever so slightly. There is going to be a bit more of a focus on defense and goaltending, losing that type of goal scoring. And look, I know Evander Kane didn't play last year, but if he were on the team, there would be an expectation he would score something in the ballpark of 20 to 30 goals. And you didn't replace that. You didn't replace Corey Perry's 19 goals. You didn't replace Jeff Skinner's offense, even though he didn't play a lot. He did play pretty well on a per minute basis. So with that said, that's why we're honing in on the winger group, which has varying degrees of optimism and projection. That's why we started with Mangiapane, who I think is a reasonable bounce back candidate, very similar to what I had said last summer about both Jeff Skinner and Victor Arvidsson. Veterans looking for bigger roles on better teams, hoping to parlay a successful season into a bigger payday somewhere else. Jeff Skinner ultimately got it in San Jose. Victor Arvidsson ultimately getting traded to Boston. Neither worked particularly well, with both being healthy scratches at various points in the postseason this year on the road to the Stanley Cup final. But you got to take kicks at the can. And I gave Stan Bowman a lot of credit earlier in the week for doing well in the bargain bin for things like Klingberg, claving Kasperi Kapanen off of waivers, trading for Vasily Podkolzin. I give him a lot of credit for finding bargain bin guys that were worth dart throws and then having the conviction to get them in the lineup, because some teams will sign the fringe guy and then not really give them an opportunity to play into a bigger role. And that is a very nice segue into talking about Matthew Savoie, who the Oilers acquired from the Sabres last summer in a cost-clearing measure. They sent Ryan McLeod to Buffalo. Ryan McLeod signed a nice extension to stay in Buffalo this past summer. And look, at Savoie's age, he's played pretty well at the AHL level. I think it's reasonable to say the Oilers can expect some return on their investment now. I think the path to him playing in the top six might be a bit easier than Ike Howard. I think the fact that Savoie has an AHL season under his belt, he's a little more physically mature. He's played more games in the span of a season. I think people really underestimate that curve, especially going from NCAA hockey to the NHL, where you're only playing, 40 games at the most. You're playing twice a week, to every other day and then 2 and 3 days every couple of weeks, it really does begin to add up. And I think Savoie, by virtue of having been in the AHL, been around the team, has a bit more of an inside track. I think the fact he has a bit more of a playmaker profile as opposed to a goal scoring profile, I think that helps you stick in the lineup a little bit more when you're a bit more versatile. The perception of you as a player that you can do more things, that you can incorporate more people, whereas traditionally the goal scorer is viewed a bit as one-dimensional. They're limited. They can't help other guys create offense. And look, I think the Oilers at minimum need one of these guys to really hit this year. And I put Howard higher because I think it's probably a bit easier for a guy with a really great shot to figure it out alongside a great player than Savoie, who might be relegated to a third line role and playing with people who aren't as offensively gifted. If it were up to me, I would love to see Savoie get a crack at playing with Draisaitl. I would love to see Howard get a crack at playing with McDavid. But I think the path to Howard playing on McDavid's left is a bit more straightforward than Savoie on the right, at least as of this moment on this recording day. And look, that's why we have summer. That's why we have preseason. That's why we have training camp. Chris Knoblauch, he needs more information. He doesn't have a lot on Ike Howard, on Matthew Savoie. Both of those guys need to play their way into minutes. They need to play their way into results. I think the AHL having a track record there is a little bit closer to a track record at the NHL level. Of course, there's not a direct correlation. Whatever you do counting stats wise does have an adjustment. It does have a bit of a conversion rate, if you will, as if we were talking about currency from country to country. The same drawbacks for Savoie apply for Howard. How does he get Chris Knoblauch to trust him? How does he play his way into more ice time? Can he get on a penalty kill? Can he get on a second power play? Do McDavid and Draisaitl trust him? That's a really big key. We saw it last year where Corey Perry had a really nice run of form, and both McDavid and Draisaitl wanted to play with Perry more, especially as the season wore along, the playoffs wore along. You got to a Stanley Cup final where Perry was the first choice in Zach Hyman's absence. So can Matthew Savoie play his way into being one of the preferred candidates in end-of-game situations? And all of that is, again, against the backdrop of the idea, is Chris Knoblauch going to trust a young guy who doesn't have a huge track record, who maybe isn't the best forechecker, maybe isn't the best defensively? I think these are all reasonable questions as far as why it may or may not work out. Now, real quick, before we take our second and final break, I didn't pace this out particularly well. We only talked about one player in the second segment. I think Savoie has an easier path to being a better NHLer. I think Howard probably has a better path to being an impactful right away guy. I think their trajectories are relatively similar. I don't think they're first line play drivers. I think Savoie is more of a playmaker. I think Howard's more of a shooter. I think shooter, you just get him in there, get him a bunch of shots and see what happens, where Savoie needs to develop some chemistry, some intuitiveness, and some understanding of what his guys like to do. We're going to take that second and final break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we have two more wingers to hit on, or maybe one's a center. Coming up next on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Thursday edition of Locked On Oilers. And thank you so much to everyone who is bearing with us in the dog days of summer, where you're just itching for hockey and you still want to be in on the discourse. You want to know what's going on. And we'll talk about the Oilers coaching staff changes next week. Frankly, I need more information on these guys that they brought in to replace Paul Coffey, to replace Schwartz, the goalie coach. So I'm going to do a bit more research. I'll talk to some people, try and get some more anecdotal, some secondary source accounts, so that way I can speak a bit more authoritatively. That's always one of my real caveats here on Locked On Oilers. It's why I don't do a lot of prospect talk. It's why I don't do a lot of draft talk. I'm not an authority on the subject. I don't just want to repeat what other people say. I want to talk to people. I want to interview people. I want to get an understanding of what it means and being able to explain it in my own words, because then I would say I understand something well enough to repeat it. So as we move along here, I am staking next on the list would be Trent Frederick. And I said earlier in the week that I was not a big fan of the Trent Frederick trade. I don't like trading for guys who were injured. I don't like trading for guys who really haven't demonstrated a whole lot at the NHL level. And Frederick's career high in minutes is like 1345 per game, which is like a third liner. And look, is there a world where Trent Frederic turns into the long-term third line center a couple years from now? Maybe. But are you really signing a guy to an 8-year deal based on that? And look, that's probably the biggest reason I have for thinking Frederic could maybe play his way into being a running mate for Draisaitl or McDavid and being a bit more of the Evander Kane replacement. I think the fact that Stan Bowman gave him an 8-year contract, and the money's not crazy, especially as the cap goes up. I think the simple matter of the fact is you sign a guy to an 8-year deal, you have a vested interest in him performing well, a vested interest in his success. Similar to what we had said about Ike Howard earlier, the idea, well, the Oilers went out and got you. So the Oilers went out and traded for you. They gave up a second-round pick, which, reasonable value. And then they gave you an 8-year contract. And a lot of people are very skeptical about said 8-year contract. So can Trent Frederic play his way into a bigger role? Yeah, very easily. And look, everything we said about Mangiapane and the opportunity to play more, that applies here as well. Can Trent Frederic sneak onto the second power play? Can he kill penalties? Okay. Can he bump that 1345 to 15 to 16? Okay. Then he's going to have more chances to score. I know his career average in goals for a season is 13. Okay. Can we get that up to 18 to 20? He's never played with a guy as good as McDavid or Draisaitl consistently. Could he find another 5 to 10 goals in the repertoire? Should he get the right role? It's not crazy to me to see a world where Frederic could serve as effectively a facsimile of either Evander Kane or Corey Perry. I think going into last year, I probably expected Corey Perry to contribute at the most 15 goals. He gave them 19, and he had 10 in the playoffs. So if Trent Frederic can give you 15 goals and do it in a way that doesn't kill you and is defensively responsible, he forechecks aggressively, and he fights on occasion when it's necessary, I think you're going to be pretty happy with that. Now, manufacturing that is going to be a tougher question. I don't know how good his wheels are going to be considering how rough he looked in the playoffs, how immobile he looked, that he was getting to good places, but he wasn't able to finish. His timing never looked particularly right. And you would hope a full offseason is going to do some wonders for that. But at the same time, I think he has probably an easier case to earning Chris Knoblauch's trust than, say, Savoie or Howard, just because of his track record of experience, the fact he's been on really good teams before, that Bruins team a couple years ago that has the best regular season record of all time in this format. I think that's well within reason to say Frederic probably has a bit more of an inside track to a bigger role than the younger guys, because we know how the Oilers operate. The Oilers are not in the business of giving young guys opportunities to make mistakes, to learn, to get better. They want guys being more or less finished products that get dropped into the lineup. And then because they're already finished products, they do have lower ceilings, but they also have higher floors. I can see a world where Trent Frederic gets what would effectively have been Evander Kane's minutes. He's 15, 16 minutes per night. That goal total creeps up towards 20 because he's playing with Draisaitl on a consistent basis. That's not crazy at all. I think that's well within the range of outcomes. But the counterpoint, and why I think it's unlikely, he's never really been that guy. The Bruins last year, I know he was injured. The Bruins desperately needed help in their forward group each of the last 2 years. And Frederic, he did not play his way into a larger role on a team that needed to get cheaper and that needed to get younger. If the Bruins saw a path to Frederic being an impactful top 6 player, they would have kept him. The Bruins very much, based on the contracts they've handed out to Jeremy Swayman, to David Pastrnak, to Charlie McAvoy, the free agent splurge they went on with Zadorov, Elias Lindholm, they very clearly want to still be a playoff team. And to continue to sustain a window of contention, you need to integrate younger pieces because they're cheaper, because they have the capacity to raise your team's ceiling. And it would have made a lot of sense if the Bruins said, okay, we'll re-rack, we'll run it back. We think if we're healthy, we'll have a good chance. If Swayman comes in with a full training camp, plays better, I think we can make something happen here. And instead, the Bruins said, all right, he's hurt. Let's cut our losses. Let's get something back. And let's really try and stick the landing, if you will, and try and figure out how we get better from here. And I think if Frederic had stayed in Boston because the Bruins felt he had a path to being a top 6 winger, I think the Bruins would have did it because they desperately need help for their forward group. And then The last player on this list, the one I know the least about and why I've saved him for last, that's David Tomasek, who European free agent, and Stan Bowman has a pretty good track record with these European free agents, signing guys from the European leagues. Of course, Artemi Panarin being an example of the most successful one. But by and large, the biggest reason I think he has the capacity to stick and be an impactful player. He's been playing in men's leagues a long time. He's 29 years old. There's not really going to be a learning curve, a physical adjustment. Sure, the ice surface in Europe being bigger is definitely something to keep in mind. But I think that if you can play at a high enough level to lead the Swedish Elite League in points, you're at the very least a functional NHL player. I'm not saying you're great. I'm not saying you're a first liner. But I think if you play well enough to lead a league in points, even if it is the Swedish League, I think you can provide something of value at the NHL level. I think the fact he's a veteran, I think the fact he's 29, I think those work in his favor very similarly to what we had said about Trent Frederick and what we didn't say about Howard and Savoie. Sure, Tomasek doesn't have big NHL experience, and Chris Knoblauch's getting his first taste of coaching him this upcoming year, but at the very least, this is somebody who's been a professional for a long time, who's going to show up ready to try and play their way, very similar to what we had said about Mangiapane before. If he plays well enough on a one-year deal, there's a path there to making some money at the NHL level, especially with the cap going up across the board for the next couple of seasons. I can see a world where Tomasek starts out at the bottom half of the lineup, plays really well for a little bit, gets some spurts in the top six, and then stays there for a few weeks. If the Oilers can play Kasperi Kapanen in the top six for 35, 40 regular season games, it's not out of the question David Tomasek could get in there for 20 or 30 games. I think that's well within the range of outcomes. Now, look, I think if he does, that's probably not a good sign for Savoie or for Howard because he's taking minutes away from one of them. But at the very least, if he's playing, if he's performing, you can accept that to some degree. You can work on that. And to sum it all up, to wrap up today's show, I like laying it out with both arguments for both sides. I think there is, I wouldn't say there's equally. I think there's a reasonable chance all five of these guys flop. I think there's a reasonable chance all five of these guys do well. And of course, as statistics would tell you, some of them will probably do pretty well. Some of them will be fine. And one or two of them will be pretty bad. That's just the way normal distributions work. I don't expect any of these guys to be crazy good. I don't expect Ike Howard to be, say, not a Conn Smythe, excuse me. I don't expect Ike Howard or Matthew Savoie to be a Calder Trophy winner or anything. I don't think either of those guys is going to be in a situation to win Rookie of the Year from a stats or from an impact, a value perspective. So I'd be very skeptical of that. And I think there's a path to them serving useful roles. And look, none of these guys needs to do it for a full season. If you can aggregate the performances of these five guys to offset the losses of Perry, Arvidsson, and Skinner, okay, the aggregate works in the regular season. In the playoffs, it becomes a bit more of an issue, but that's a different subject for a different episode. I want to thank everyone that made Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network where we've got your team covered every day. Be sure to check out Locked On NHL and Locked On NHL Game Night on the Locked On NHL feeds, wherever you get your podcasts or over on YouTube. Subscribe to Locked On Oilers wherever you get your podcasts. If you're on Apple or Spotify, please leave the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. Let me know, out of the guys we talked about on today's show, who do you think is the most likely to break out? Who do you think is the most likely to flop? I will talk to you guys on Monday. Everyone have a safe and fun weekend. Until then, let's go Oilers.